He is alive. Good morning. Welcome to each one here. Welcome to those who are joining on Facebook or online. Otherwise, I greet you in the name of Jesus Christ, the living hope, the living water, the one who invites us to come to him, to drink from him, and to be satisfied. He invites us to bring our heavy things to him. That's what he does. He invites us to bring our disappointments, our frustrations, our sadness and sorrow and fears and anxieties, all those things that weigh us down, and to place them at his feet, to let go of them. You know, I thought, just as I was meditating before coming up here, I thought, a good object lesson would have been, perhaps it'll happen sometime, but would be to have one of you with a number of backpacks and other luggage and to be carrying it. I mean, you just couldn't live well, right? But if you would try to sit into one of the pews and you think, it's just stuff I'm carrying, it doesn't affect anyone else. Well, try sitting down beside someone. They'd have a backpack on their lap and a suitcase on their feet, and it affects the people around us. And Jesus invites us to bring those bags to him and to set them down, to actually let go of them. The things that weigh us down, that prevent us from experiencing the peace and satisfaction that we all desire. There isn't a person here, there isn't a person listening in that does not desire to have peace, satisfaction, and contentment. It is universal. And Jesus is offering it to us, and he is inviting us to lay those things down, to bring our baggage to him. He says in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I need to many times over come back to that, of just coming to him and setting it down. Because I find myself picking up bags throughout the day, and sometimes in the evening I need to remind myself, I got to set that down. Some of us are carrying bags right now that are filled with hard things. That's, I suppose that is just part of living in a broken world filled with broken people, and things happen that break the heart of God. And you could say, well, how would a God of love, allow some things to happen? And I wish I could answer it better, other than that from the beginning it was not so. From the beginning it was humanity that rejected him. And then he did something that none of us would do. He made an avenue to be saved so that we could be redeemed from that brokenness. And he sent his son. He didn't send himself. Some of us would be willing to send ourselves. None of us would be willing to send our child. God did. He gave the most expensive, the most supreme sacrifice that is imaginable, and gave that to make a way for us to come back to him, to restore. And so those hard things that we're carrying, we can place at his feet. For some of us, we've experienced losses, the death of a loved one, or a broken relationship, or the stresses of life, the relational stresses that maybe at home, maybe at the workplace, maybe in this group right here. Maybe there are stressful relationships. Maybe there's financial stress, that the loss of finances, or the rising cost of living that we were not planning for, and it's pushing us to hard places, to humiliating places. And it's things we carry that stress. For some, it's just fear, the fear of the unknown, or the fear of how things will work out, the fear of the future, or fear of being alone, or fear of not having friends, or fear of not passing the course or the fear of, the list goes on. We all have them. And he invites us to come and to place those things at his feet. So what do we do when the disappointments in life or the stresses in life seem greater than we can bear? How do we respond? How can we prevent our losses from becoming luggage? We all experience losses. Every person in the world does. And this morning we're going to be reminded that sometimes on the outside it looks so good, and we are apt to look across the fence at our neighbor and say, why is it working out for him? That people in Bible times did that. People in the 21st century are still doing that. We look at someone else and say, why are they prospering always? Don't be fooled. Things are not always as they seem. We've lived long enough to know that, I suppose. So how can we prevent our losses from becoming luggage that we carry? People turn to all sorts of wells, and I was privy to listening in to the youth Sunday school class a little bit this morning, and I just love how Derek was leading that. And we've all found ourselves in places sometimes where we're carrying those stresses or anxieties, and we go to wells sometimes that don't satisfy. Wells that leave us empty and thirsty. There's varied places where people go when they are looking to satisfy the thirst that is within. Perhaps it is substances. Perhaps it's alcohol or drugs. Maybe it's just turning to the distractions that we find on our devices, and we just spend hours of time perusing there. Perhaps it's just lust of all things and people. Those are wells that people go to, lusting after the neighbor's. In the Old Testament, it might say the neighbor's donkey. That might be now the neighbor's Silverado, or the neighbor's whatever it is, the things they have. Lust, jealousy. Perhaps it's the neighbor just. Maybe it's people that we're looking at. Perhaps people have gone to pornography or sex, and they think that will just satisfy, and they find that it's an empty well, and they drink, and it leaves them thirstier than they were before. Maybe it's popularity, the well of just, I'm going to go out with the guys, and I'm just going to be funny. I'm going to have lots of friends, and it leaves them thirsty when they get home. Maybe it's work. Maybe it's to work out more. Have that better body. I'm just going to show the people that you can turn something like this into something like that. And they're going to be amazed. God still works miracles, Dave. Don't be laughing. Okay. And we get home, and we know how we're feeling on the inside. People are doing this. Maybe it's just work more. Man, I got to prove to them that I can succeed. I'm going to put in more hours. I'm going to have more stuff. I'm going to have nicer stuff. I'm going to have bigger stuff. Oh, my truck is going to be nicer than the neighbor's. Or as I recently heard an argument between two guys about the size of their pressure washer. The funniest thing, isn't it? My pressure washer is bigger than your pressure washer. Wow. It was funny. I'm going to have more stuff. I'm going to have bigger stuff. I'm going to have nicer stuff. And at the end of the day, I can sit by myself at home, and I still know how I'm feeling on the inside. everything looks amazing on the outside, but for any of us who have walked that road and we have tried water from some of these wells, and we know it did not quench our thirst, it did not fulfill our desires, and it left us empty and wanting. And that's what I want to talk about this morning in the second sermon that has become a series. Has become a series that I've entitled Against the Current. Against the Current. It takes energy to not just go with the flow of the society around us. It takes conviction. It takes a choosing. It takes a standing. It takes no energy. It takes no strength to go with the flow. It doesn't mean that we need to be obstinate. We are not different for the sake of being different. We are different because we are found in Jesus Christ, and He gives us a life, and He provides a water that satisfies, even if on the outside it doesn't always look that great. You see, the wells I mentioned, they are crutches. Some of those things aren't bad in themselves, but if that's where you go to get your mind off the stress, if you go to any of those wells to get your mind off the anxiety, it is like putting a Band-Aid. You know, it's like going to the doctor because you have a headache and he says, I have bad news for you. There is a growth on your brain. I'm going to put a Band-Aid on it. Are you kidding me? Doctor, that doesn't... No, it will appear as though we can put on a large Band-Aid and people will know that you are dealing with a big problem, maybe. That is ludicrous. And that is what you will find if you go to any of those wells. It is like putting a Band-Aid on a tumor. It is a crutch. And if you and I are not willing to face the painful places in our lives, perhaps it's something that has happened years ago. If you and I are not willing to go there and actually deal with that pain, it might mean seeing a therapist. It might mean talking with a trusted mentor. It might mean calling up a friend and saying, we need to talk. I need to talk to someone. Something that happened in my life, and I've been carrying this bag for my whole life, and it's time to deal with it. I'm done carrying it. If you and I are not willing to deal with our past, whether it is in the distant past or something that has just happened, if we do not, we are withholding the abundance of blessing that God would love to pour into your life and into mine. If I have had relationships with, say, other women, and I do not deal with it, my marriage will not thrive. It's impossible. I can ignore it. I can push it down. I can pretend that it's not there. But inside, we are spiritual beings. We are not just physical beings. We are spiritual beings. And so if we do not deal with those places in our lives and allow the deliverer to redeem, we will allow a root to continue to grow. And roots grow. We all know that. If you don't, why don't you just try this? When you're cleaning out the garden next summer and there's weeds growing, cut them off. Just cut them off. Roots will grow. And in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15, this follows just following Scott's message a couple weeks ago on running the race of life well. Powerful sermon he shared. And later in that verse, in that chapter, it says that we need to be careful. I'm going to have to paraphrase, but we need to be careful. It's verse 15 of Hebrews 12, that we do not cut off anyone from the grace of God, lest a root of bitterness would grow. That means bringing people to him. Bitterness is being described here as a root. If we do not allow the deliverer to redeem, we will allow a root of bitterness to grow in us, and the root will rob us from living victoriously. It will rob us from living faithfully. It will rob us from living in grace. It will continue to grow. Dear friends, there is no, so many times we are perhaps embarrassed, or we think, man, I just don't want to reveal that part of me to anyone. God is exalted. There's a few things. God is exalted in confession. I don't want to offend anyone, but none of you have it together. None of us. I don't have it. We all stumble. We all get it wrong sometimes. Our struggles they vary. God is exalted in confession, and God is exalted in humility. And when I refuse to allow myself to confess, it is pride. It is pride that is preventing that. And this root of bitterness, I can hide it for a while. But how many times have you ever thought this or heard someone rant, or perhaps it's in a hockey game and they snap and you say, man, where'd that come from? That is so out of character. It comes from a place within every time. When I'm stressed, when I am anxious, or when I am frustrated and I go play hockey, it can be healthy to really exert myself, but I need to be aware of something. I am likely going to have to be extremely careful. I'm going to snap. I'm apt to snap because it comes from what I'm carrying with me on the inside. That's so many times how it is. And so sometimes I have to just ask, I wonder what the real issue is. I wonder what's going on. It's surely not the thing that provoked it. So how can we prevent our losses from becoming luggage, or our brokenness from becoming baggage? Jesus said this, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest in your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. What Jesus is saying is the burden of humility, of confession, is light compared to carrying the bags. So before we get into the sermon drawing from 2 Kings again, what can we do when we find ourselves carrying the bags? Number one, recognize the baggage. The first thing for us to do is to recognize the pain, recognize the disappointment, recognize the fear, recognize the betrayal, recognize the hurts that someone has caused. We have to recognize it. That is step one. In verse 28, that's what you're doing. You're recognizing that you are carrying a burden. You're recognizing that that you have a fear or an anxiety, or that someone hurt you or mistreated you. And point number two, you got to face it honestly. Saying it's not a big deal is a big deal. Face it honestly. God does not work in dishonesty. To be honest, to confess, and to set down bags takes much humility. It does. It takes a lot of humility to just say, no, I am undone. I sinned. James chapter 4 verse 6 says this, that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And who does not desire grace? Every one of us does. We all need grace. And when you think about that, he says that he opposes the proud. And I know one thing for sure. I don't want to stand in opposition to God. But when I choose to be proud, to not humble myself, I am choosing to put myself in opposition to him. We must deal with and face the painful and the broken things in our lives. We are spiritual beings, and things affect us on the inside. They don't just go away. You know, it reminded me of, years ago, I was playing in the year-end baseball tournament in the league where I played, and I noticed throughout the day that my one finger was feeling a little stiff, and there was a red dot, like I got a bite on it. Sort of ignored it. It kept getting kind of stiff, and then I noticed that I had an infection. But I wanted to finish the tournament. And we hung out afterward for a while. And then I started seeing this red line that was going up my arm, and it was up by my elbow that started at this little bite, and I'm going, that's probably not good. Not really a great nurse, but... So we went to the hospital, and it wasn't a big deal, the doctor said, until it gets to your heart. And he said, in that vein would go to your heart. If you ignore the little infection, it becomes a big deal. And he said, you would definitely have been hospitalized, and it may have been fatal. That was a poison. It was a poison in my blood. And when it would have gotten that far, it would have killed me. That's what happens when we ignore the small root, the small thing. And we say it's not a big deal, and it just continues to grow, and it just continues to go. And eventually, it will kill. And so Hebrews 12:15, see to it that no one falls short of the grace of God. You and I are the ministers of that grace, are we not? We cannot provide that grace, but you and I can live in that grace and minister that grace to those around us. And that is a beautiful thing. See to it that nobody falls short of that grace or fails to obtain that grace. Otherwise, a root of bitterness may grow. I'd like to use three. So bitterness can be external or internal. And I'm going to give, just before we go to Kings, 3 Old Testament stories where someone was bitter. So, the first picture here is from Genesis chapter 27. I think this might be the first time in the Bible we read of someone being bitter. Now I wonder, is there a child here who thinks they know? It's not a really clear picture on which story it is. Is there a child here that thinks they know which story it is? Who are the people in this picture? You're allowed to be wrong. Is there an adult here that thinks they got it? It's really vague, isn't it? They're at a tent. The man on his knees is quite hairy. And his name is Esau. He has come for the blessing that he scorned years earlier. Didn't deal with it. He scorned his birthright. And when he came to Jacob, to Isaac. When he came to Isaac, and he said, I'm here for the birthright. And Isaac says, I already gave it It says this in Genesis 27:34. When Esau heard his father's words, he burst out with a loud and bitter cry. You can imagine this man crying loudly, and he says, "Bless me too, Father. What about me? What about my blessing, Father?" Bitterness is it being expressed here. It's coming out of him in a bitter emotion. And he says quietly, "I'm going to kill Jacob. I am going to kill my brother. My father is old. I'm just going to wait until he dies. And then I'm going to kill him. For he has taken what should have been mine." That bitterness that he then carried for many years, his brother had to flee for his life. The next picture here is in Esther chapter 4. If you read through Esther chapter 3, the king has given Haman a signet and says, "You can do with it what you want." He gave him his royal ring. And Haman, the hater of the Jews, passed a decree and spread it throughout all the land that the Jews should be killed, that all of them should be killed. The last verse in chapter 3 says something like this: "And Haman and the king sat down to eat and drink." Esther chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes, and he put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried with a loud and bitter cry. Bitterness is not something that has just started in the recent years, or from, we have maybe more education, with more knowledge, with dealing with psychology. It is not just recent. Mordecai goes out into the streets, and he reveals this and has a bitter cry when he learns of what's happening to his people. And that's when he calls on Esther, and just later in this she's already queen. Later in this chapter, he goes to her and he says, "Esther, you need to do something." And she said, "I can't. He's going to kill me. If I go into the king's presence without his invitation, he's going to kill me." And Mordecai says, "This may be the reason why you are in this place, why God brought you here." The bitter cry of Mordecai. And finally, the last one is of Job. Job is, he's often, we often put him on a pedestal, kind of, because it does say at the beginning that in all of those great tragedies that he experienced, he didn't sin. But eventually Job did. Eventually he did show his humanity. In chapter 10, verse 1, he says this: "I hate my life. I loathe my life. I will give free utterance to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul." He became a bitter man. In fact, he ended up becoming a self-righteous, arrogant man. If you read chapter 31, he says, "Oh God, if I would take you to court, you wouldn't stand a chance." And he says, "If I have ever sinned, then I deserve this." But he goes on throughout that entire chapter and simply declares his self-righteousness. 3 Old Testament characters who experienced bitterness, bitter emotions. The Apostle Paul says this to the church at Ephesus. He writes, "Put away bitterness, get rid of it." In fact, that's what it says in a lot of translations, "and rid yourselves of bitterness." Bitterness often is born out of jealousy, envy, looking at other people or other people's things and wondering why you can't have the same. Covetousness. Bitterness, in the list that Paul has there, expresses itself often in anger. He says this, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31, get rid of all bitterness and wrath and anger and or harsh words, slander. That's talking about other people. It seems to be connected to the bitterness that he's mentioning, and instead, be kind to each other. Is it really that hard to be kind to each other? Deal with it. Get rid of it. Bitterness destroys. Bitterness destroys individuals. It destroys marriages. You could maybe say, I talked about drinking from the wrong wells. Sometimes people may have said bitterness is the gateway sin. You might think of very few people plan to ruin their lives with heroin or cocaine. I have yet to be at a wedding where the couple getting married is planning to divorce. But something happened. For so many people, something happens sometime, somewhere along the line. They didn't deal with something small. Bitterness destroys. So it could be called the gateway sin. You might think, I'm just going to start with having a joint every night. It helps me relax, and it's really how I'm going to cope through this stress between me and my wife. And if that's what you're going to be left wanting and thirsty for something that satisfies. It doesn't fix the marriage. And so eventually, perhaps, things are better apart and they choose to divorce. Maybe at that point, the pain on the inside drives people to the harder drugs. It is no different when we don't deal with the small sin. I sometimes think of that when I very much think of that earlier in this chapter, Ephesians 4. It says, do not let the sun go down when you're angry. And I think of that many times when I'm frustrated. I've been frustrated with Laura. I cannot imagine right now why I would ever be so. But turns out we're both humans. And I often think of that at night. How am I going to deal with this before we go to sleep? Do not let the sun go down upon your wrath is what Paul says. But what it means is deal with it. Do not just ignore it. It becomes that. It grows into bitterness. And eventually, what once you loved, you actually hate. You despise and you cannot stand it. Or the person, or whatever it is, because bitterness destroys. It is possible to love long and love faithfully, but it's not easy. I think that you go to perhaps a marriage celebration, an open house, someone who's celebrating 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, and we just say, congratulations. Guys, those people dealt with hard things. My guess is they dealt with bitterness. And they dealt with it, and they got rid of it, and they chose to love. Bitterness destroys. It destroys individuals, marriages, family relationships. It destroys church relations. It destroys churches. It destroys brotherhoods. It hurts. And bitterness, to get rid of it, you must choose to get rid of it, and you must choose to forgive. If you want to thrive, if you want your relationships to thrive, we'll need to deal with the bitterness. 2 Kings chapter 2, 19. There's just 19 to 22. These are the only verses we'll be looking at from the 2 Kings series, and I'm going to read them. Last week, we read the first verses of 2 Kings 2. Elisha is now in Jericho. He had gone with Elijah. They crossed the Jordan River, and that's where Elijah was taken to glory in a fiery chariot, and only his cloak was left behind. And Elisha received a double portion of Elijah's spirit, and he returns to Jericho. And he's in Jericho. Now the men, and it reads like this, now the men of the city of Jericho said to Elisha, behold, the situation of this city is pleasant as my Lord sees it. All right, you are here. What you are seeing, it looks so good on the outside, doesn't it, Elisha? But Elisha, the water is bad. The land is unfruitful. What he's saying is, it looks good to the one looking in from the outside. Isn't that how we are so many times? I just mayn't let anyone see how it actually is. I may not let anyone in. I'm just going to keep this facade up. I'm just going to keep my mask on. I'm just going to keep, laughing. Everything looks good. And Elisha says, bring me a bowl and put salt in it. And so they brought it to him. And he went to the spring of water, and he threw the salt in it and said, thus says the Lord, I've healed the water. From now on, neither death nor miscarriage shall come from it. And so the water has been healed to this day, according to the word that Elisha spoke. In fact, I believe in Jericho, even to this day, there's still a spring called the Spring of Elisha, bringing forth good water. Excuse me. First of all, note the condition. Everything looked good. It looked good on the outside. Everything was favorable. The soil was good. The climate was good. The city was delightful. It looked good. Have we not been there sometimes when I'm just like, we just keep looking good? As long as everybody else thinks I have it together, Jericho would have been the kind of place that you would have looked at and said, I might buy a house there when I retire. I might raise my family in Jericho. It looked good on the outside, but it was barren. The word barren actually means miscarriage. In this translation, I use the word miscarriage, where things would start to grow but would never produce fruit. That's what miscarriage means. The vineyards and the trees would bud and blossom, but they'd never have fruit. It was barren. The ground was barren. The water was bad. The problem was not so much that the ground was bad, it was that the water was bad. Note the remedy. The people realized their hope was in God. The people realized they need Elisha. He is the prophet from God. Dear friends, you and I need the same realization. You and I need to come to the same place. Our hope rests alone in a living God. Hallelujah. And they recognized that God could bring healing. And God can bring healing and restoration to your place of barrenness as well, wherever that is. He can. It is not always the way that we wish it was. That is reality. But he brings healing to spirits, and he wishes to bring us to living in abundance rather than barrenness. And they came to Elisha, and he said, bring me salt. I don't know if I'm making a parallel here that shouldn't be made, but Jesus said, you are salt. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. Go be the salt. Be the salt. Go to those places where the water is bitter and be the salt. Go to the places where there is barrenness and be the salt. That's what and Elisha said, bring me the salt. The other thing he didn't go to the barrels or the buckets. He didn't go to Ishmael's house and say, hey, brother, I'd like to see the water in here. And he didn't sprinkle salt into the buckets of water that Ishmael had in his house. He went to the source. He went to the spring. He went to the place where that bitterness was coming from. You and I need to do the same. Just sprinkling our salt on our anger issues doesn't fix it. Go to the root. And if it comes from something that happened a long time ago, go to the root. Go to the source. We have to deal with the source. He didn't just deal with barrels or buckets. And in verse 22, there was healing because God said so. There was healing, and the waters were healed that day, and they ran as a stream like they should have, and they brought forth life. And there was fruitfulness. There was fruitfulness. Does it mean that if we do this, we get rid of our bitterness, that we can then, everything will just go our way? Of course not. But it means you can be fruitful. It means you can produce fruit again. It means that the Holy Spirit will be released within you. That's what it means. It means that you will bear fruit in the kingdom. And God longs to bless you. He does. He longs to take you from those hurting places. He longs to take you from those places and bless you. But I don't remember if I said this. I don't think it was here. But in thinking through the word blessing, that's a word we're interested in. Oh, God, pour out your blessing on me. We tend to think of blessing as being physical. We tend to think of it in terms of wealth. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know of any account in the New Testament where the term blessing, the blessing of God, is ever connected to material things. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are you when you're persecuted for my sake, Jesus said. Then you're going to have identity with me like you can't imagine. We are so human, and we tend to think in material ways. And God wishes to pour out his blessing on us. He wishes to bring us into abundance. And so, finally, these very famous, this familiar verse from Jeremiah. And I'd like to close with this, where God says to Jeremiah, Jeremiah, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And we love that verse, but that is what God says he will do. What does he want from you and me? What is our part of the deal? What's our part of the bargain? It's in the following verses. Do we have these memorized as well? Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me, and you will find me when you seek me with all your heart, and I will be found. I will be found. Dear friends, some of us here, we've experienced bitter things. Dealing with bitterness is not easy. Please do not hear me minimizing your pain by saying God would love to heal it. Healing is generally not an overnight thing. Healing is sometimes a long journey. It is physically so, and it is spiritually so. But it doesn't mean that healing is not available. And God longs to prosper us. But what is our part? Call on him. Continue to go to him. Seek him, and you will find him. Turn your heart toward God, and you will find him. And he says, and I will be found by you. God bless you as you turn to him, and as you take the bitterness that you have experienced and bring it to his feet, and he will bless you with abundance. May God bless you and give you courage as you do that.